Shalom, Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com, and welcome to this little series of conversations talking about sacred name teachings in Bibles and some problems with them. This is our second last little chat, and in this one we're going to be looking at how these teachings claim to be Messianic when they're actually not. It may surprise you to hear that the label Messianic is being increasingly misapplied. I would even say it's being hijacked. I know, dramatic word, right? Originally, if you were Messianic, it meant you were a Messianic Jew, or at least closely involved with a Messianic Jewish synagogue. And if something was Messianic, it meant it was Messianic Jewish. In the last couple decades, however, the term Messianic has been co-opted by the Hebrew roots and sacred name movements. This wouldn't be such a bad thing if these movements weren't rife with so many un-Jewish notions and anti-Jewish attitudes, but they are. And the result is that the real Messianic movement is getting drastically misrepresented. Let's talk about the history of these three movements for a couple minutes. Firstly, here's the story of the Messianic Jewish movement. In the 1800s, the number of Jewish people coming to faith in Yeshua began to increase. They, generally speaking, called themselves Hebrew Christians and formed several alliances, starting with the Hebrew Christian Alliance of Great Britain in 1866 and culminating in the International Hebrew Christian Alliance in 1925. The following were the stated aims of the IHCA, the International Hebrew Christian Alliance. As you can see, they were both powerful and prophetic in their time. I'm not going to read all of these for you, but here, I will move myself from the top here so you can read this for a split second. Pause it if you want to read that. Okay, and I'm back. And what I do want to point out to you here is this is very powerful. To interpret the spirit of the Jewish people to the Christian world, and the spirit of the Christian gospel to the Jews. Fourth objective was very interesting also. To make it possible for Hebrew Christians who may desire to do so to share in the activities of Zionism, this is 1925, and to claim for them equal rights in terms of the Balfour Declaration. And then a couple other things also. Here are a couple of pictures from that era. This publication is from the newly formed Alliance in Great Britain. And it's very powerful and, again, very prophetic. You can even just... In 1866, and The Scattered Nation was the name of their publication. They say, such a meeting has not taken place since the apostolic age. I think they realized that they were doing something that was a really big deal. Anyways, you can Google the history of the Hebrew Christian movement. You can find these documents in full for yourself. I'm just kind of sharing these as a couple little snapshots for you of this early movement and really how exciting it was. Here's a picture from, as you can maybe read there, the Second International Conference at Hamburg. And then the Executive Committee elected at Hamburg in if I'm not mistaken, it says 28. So that's one of the first executive committees of the International Hebrew Christian Alliance. Another landmark was the founding of the first Hebrew Christian church in New York City in 1885. Really, this was America's first Messianic congregation, as far as I can gather. Here's a fuzzy little picture of their synagogue for you. So, if you visited a Messianic congregation, in a way, this is where and when it all began. The Hebrew Christian movement continued to grow. Then, the 1960s struck. Israel recaptured Jerusalem, and suddenly it was groovy to be Jewish. The Jesus People movement broke out, and a ton of Jewish kids got turned on to Jesus. And the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America voted and became the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. This was more than just a name change, too. The movement had shifted from a scattering of mostly assimilated Jews to a core of congregations that were unapologetically Messianic and unapologetically Jewish. That was the beginning of the Messianic Jewish movement as such, which has grown since then to hundreds of congregations worshiping together as Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah. If you've ever heard that song by Lamb, then you can appreciate just like what a flagship phrase that really is for the Messianic Jewish movement. In the 1990s, a new movement began to emerge. Christians were increasingly feeling drawn to learn about the Hebraic roots of their faith, which was a fantastic thing. I believe that was a real move of the Holy Spirit. just at its very core, feeling drawn to learn about the Hebraic roots of the Christian faith. This awakening was characterized by a love for Israel, the usage of the name Yeshua and some other Hebrew keywords, and a return to keeping a little more of the Torah, mostly what I call the 3 F's. Food, in other words, you throw away the bacon and probably cry for a while too. Maybe eat, turkey bacon in the meantime to help you get over it. Feasts, Sabbath, Passover, all that, and fringes. That's been my observation for most people in the Hebrew Roots movement. When they talk about being Torah observant, what they're talking about is the 3 F's, food, feasts, and fringes. And unfortunately, there are some mitzvot that commands that a lot of people who are Torah observant don't really do still. Okay, for me personally, whenever I hear whenever I hear the phrase Hebrew roots, I think of like literal vegetable roots, like Hebrew roots. So let's go with the metaphor for a moment. The main ingredient in this newly emerging salad was Christians coming from traditional churches or from Messianic Jewish congregations. Also, just as a side note, Christians coming from house church backgrounds, often homeschooling backgrounds also. It also included a pinch of worldwide Church of God people looking for the true church after their previous true church fell apart, and a dash of Seventh-day Adventists who felt ripped off because they weren't allowed to celebrate any of the feasts except the Sabbath, and they were tired of grape juice and wanted some real wine already. Okay, I may be reading into motives a little here for the sake of humor, but that was generally the recipe. Christians coming from either traditional churches, Messianic Jewish backgrounds, house church, homeschooling, some worldwide Church of God people, Seventh-day Adventist people. The most influential teachers in this movement have also generally come from these backgrounds. And I did want to include a meme here with you-know-who saying, I pity the foo, but instead saying, I pity the food, because we're talking about food. But I couldn't think of a good, second line for the meme, so I skipped it. Anyways, you can imagine it. Maybe you can think of your own second line. The Hebrew Roots movement, it's very fluid and has changed considerably in the last couple decades. It started out closer to the Messianic Jewish movement, and in a way it was birthed by it. Unfortunately, 3 teachings were embraced by this movement that distanced it from the Messianic Jewish community, and got most of its teachers banned from Messianic Jewish congregations and conferences too. The first teaching to significantly damage the relationship was the two-house teaching, which basically says that Gentile believers are the lost 10 tribes of Israel, if not literally then figuratively. So in that construct, Israel is comprised of 2 houses, and the Jewish people are the southern tribes, headed up by Judah, the house of Judah, and then Gentile Christians today, either literally or figuratively, they're like the lost 10 tribes of Israel, the house of Israel, or Ephraim. So that was a teaching that significantly damaged the relationship between this newly emerging movement and the Messianic Jewish community. The second controversial teaching was the one law teaching, which basically says that Jewish and Gentile believers are both equally obligated to keep the whole Torah, including adult male circumcision. And then the third divisive teaching was the sacred name teaching, which leads us to the question of where these teachings, the sacred name teachings, came from. Before we talk about the history of the sacred name movement, I just want to say that this influx of other teachings into the Hebrew Roots movement reminds me of a confluence. A confluence is a geographical point where one river flows into another. Unfortunately, in this case, the rivers flowing in were dirty and only served to muddy the waters. Here are a couple of pictures of confluences from around the world to help illustrate this. Isn't this unreal? So you have this one river that obviously is very clean, pure. You have this other dirty river flowing in. And as you can see, this is what happens. Clean river, dirty river, dirty river. Clean river, dirty river. Guess what happens downstream in situations like that? That dirty river. So, speaking of dirty influences, the sacred name movement is just as diverse as the Hebrew Roots movement and almost as grassroots. Most historians would trace its beginnings back to the 1920s, when a number of teachers and groups began emphasizing the usage of the Hebrew names of God and Jesus, which they referred to as the true names. The Jehovah's Witnesses movement was also just getting off the ground at this time, which of course was also a sacred name movement, and still is today, and it may have added fuel to this fire or even sparked it. Herbert Armstrong was also part of this early melting pot before going on to start the Worldwide Church of God. These pioneer sacred name teachers felt very strongly about using the true names of the Father and the Son, but it took them a while to figure out what they were. After running through dozens of variations by the 1950s, many had settled on this name and pronunciation for the Father, and Yeshua for the Son, or Yeshua, whatever. In the 1950s, New Testament was published, followed up by a complete Bible in 1962, which was based on the King James text, but used the names, this name for God, and Yeshua, and also had Elohim for God. This brought a little more uniformity to the movement, but there were still dozens of splinter sects, each with their own true names, which continues to be the case today. The sacred name movement may be famous for many things, but unity is not one of them. So that's a quick overview of these three movements. As you can see, they're very different, but because they all use the Hebrew name of Jesus, or some form of it, they can be confused at first glance, which is exactly what's happened. Sincere Christians want to study the Jewish roots of their faith. They see a sacred name Bible with some Hebrew in it, and before you know it, they've been sucked into the sacred name vortex. Or, let's say they visit a Messianic Jewish congregation, experience a spiritual awakening, which does happen, and then they slide into the Hebrew roots world where they absorb all sorts of anti-Jewish venom. And I've talked with lots of people about the history of these movements and the differences between them, and many people are surprised that there is a big difference between the Messianic Jewish movement and the Hebrew Roots movement. If you've been around for a while, then you probably know that they're not the same. But if you're new, you may not have known that, and you probably should. What doesn't help is that many Hebrew Roots teachers say they're Messianic when they're not, when in fact they're totally out of relationship with the Messianic Jewish community, and many have even been banned from Messianic congregations and conferences. It also doesn't help that some sacred name publishers use the term Messianic in their Bibles when they're so not. Co-opting the Messianic label like this isn't just misleading and insulting. It's a direct attack on the Messianic Jewish community. And trust me, the Messianic Jewish movement already has enough enemies. So when you get kicked out of the Messianic Jewish movement and banned from Messianic Jewish organizations, congregations, and conferences, you have to wonder how Messianic you really are. The bottom line is that everyone is welcome to join the Messianic Jewish movement, but if you don't have a positive relationship with the leaders of the Messianic Jewish community, or if you're teaching stuff that the scholars of Messianic Judaism have rejected, seriously, you shouldn't call yourself Messianic. That's misleading. The words Messianic and Jewish, they're like Siamese twins. Try to separate them, and you'll kill them both. So you can't have the Messianic without having the Jewish. Does that mean you have to convert to Judaism? Does that mean you have to become Jewish? No. But if you're going to say you're Messianic, you need to at least be aligned with the Messianic Jewish movement. There has to be some respect there. There has to be like a positive relationship. You know what I'm saying? Yes, just like us, overly attached girlfriend. Siamese twins. Try to separate them and you'll kill them both. Just like us. Alright, so now you know why I say that the term Messianic has been hijacked, and why I call sacred name Bibles pseudo-Messianic. They're fake Messianic, they're not real. In our last conversation in this series, I'm going to show you how the dynamics we've talked about here in this discussion, and in our previous two discussions, are combining to create a fertile breeding ground for a new anti-Semitism that you probably never imagined. I do hope you'll join me for that crescendo.